I first
But they
met
started in 65 and
Right.
66. That's after years of war.
Right.
And in fact, the large-scale protest which finally took place was after about 5 years of war. By then, South Vietnam had been destroyed. The war had expanded to the rest of Indochina. And yeah, they were effective, but very late. And in the elite sectors, you know, the articulate sectors, like the media, commentary, there was really never any, virtually never any protest in the war, of the war. It was protest on tactical grounds. It was very striking what happened by the end of the war in 1975, formal end of the war. The population, about 70% of the population, regarded the war as fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. Those are the polls from roughly then. If you look at the liberal commentary in the press, say at the extreme end, maybe Anthony Lewis in the New York Times, he summed up the war by 75 by saying the United States entered Vietnam with blundering efforts to do good. Well, efforts to do good is a tautology. Our state did it, it's to do good. Blundering, it didn't quite work. So we entered with blundering efforts to do good, but by 1969 it was clear that the war was a disaster, too costly to ourselves. Now, that's what you could read in Pravda in 1985, you know, when the Russians were in Afghanistan. But that was considered sharp critique of the war. Meanwhile, the public was way off to the anti-war side.
Well, let's fast forward to now. In those years, we had conscription. We had the classrooms that you and I taught in, full of young men who were having to make critical decisions about what they were going to do, whether to go live in Sweden, Canada, not register for the draft, resist, or go in the military. 55,000 United States military died, some 400,000 were injured, countless hundreds of thousands of more came back with psychological disabilities, which they suffer to this day. Here we are at this time in kind of a perpetual militarized situation in this country, strike the kind of, in a perpetual militarized situation in this country, where the Obama administration is now facing a decision, supposedly, about Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. But the protest against that, such as it is an intellectualized one, largely on the internet, to some extent in what's left of the left media. We don't have conscription. It does not reach down into every classroom and every family and every neighborhood, the militarization of this country. Where it does reach down into is the economy, but nobody talks about that.
Well, you're right, but we have to ask, why don't we have a draft now? Well, we don't have a draft because the Army and the Pentagon and the government realized that in Vietnam they had made a tactical mistake. You cannot use a civilian army to carry out a brutal colonial war. Our predecessors didn't use colonial armies, citizens' armies. So the French used the Foreign Legion, you know, the British used the Gurkhas, or in our the Revolutionary War, the Hessians, you know. There was a sprinkling, the officer corps might be civilian, but basically mercenary armies. By the late 60s, the top leadership realized they had made a mistake. I don't really think it's because of the effect of the draft at home. I think that's vastly exaggerated. In fact, I mean, you were involved, I was involved. The kind of leading edge of the anti-war movement, like say the resistance, it was mostly led by kids who would never get drafted, like theology students or students at the elite universities. If they didn't want to get drafted, they didn't have to. They put themselves on the line. They faced serious dangers, many years in jail, permanent exile. It's not an easy decision for an 18-year-old kid. They did it. It was very courageous. It spread. It had a big effect. But that can't be recognized in the mainstream doctrine. It's dangerous to recognize that people can take honorable, courageous actions on principled grounds. You're supposed to go as far as, say, Anthony Lewis. Tactical error cost us too much. Let's pull out. Actually, that's like Obama. he's considered in the doctrinal system a principled opponent of the Iraq War. What was his opposition? He said it's a strategic blunder. Again, that's the same kind of thing you could have read in Pravda in 1985 and did read. People who said the invasion of Afghanistan was a strategic blunder. We don't call that principled opposition. I mean, you could have found that in the German General Staff after Stalingrad. Two-front war is a strategic blunder. What's significant is principled opposition, and that did exist. In the 60s, it still exists. In fact, in the case of Afghanistan, the protest is greater than it was in Vietnam at any comparable stage of the war. You go back to when there were 60,000 troops in Vietnam, conscripts. Protest was almost zero. It wasn't even talked about.
What do you mean protest? I don't see any protests these days very much at all, unless you count my emails.
Yeah, there's a National Day of Protest coming up.
Yes, there is, on October 17th.
Okay. All right, that's massive protest.
That's the first one in about 2 years. I mean, what I'm saying
but,
is...
But in the 60s, there was nothing.
For a while.
That's a big difference.
What do you make of the fact that the debate in officialdom over Afghanistan now seems to be either let's turn it into another Vietnam, let's keep pouring troops in for one strategic goal or another, or let's pull back to the Joe Biden solution, which is basically airborne death squads. Send in the predators, we'll find out where they are, maybe we'll know, maybe we won't. There'll be a lot of collateral damage, but at least our boys and girls won't be in danger. And those seem to be the permissible contours in Washington of the debate. Massive military intervention with consequent great loss of life, or surgical, as they say, military intervention with less loss of life on the side of the interveners, but probably equal or greater loss of life on the part of the subject population.
Again, that's correct. But I'm not suggesting that there has been a shift in elite attitudes. There's been a shift in popular attitudes. When they talk about massive intervention, it doesn't even begin to compare with Vietnam. I mean, they're talking about maybe 100,000 people. By 1965, when protests started, they were talking about hundreds of thousands, plus 50, 70,000 mercenaries and so on. So yes, those are the parameters of debate, and it's our fault that those are the parameters. For example, we ought to be pointing out that there's a fundamental problem in the debate in Washington. The relevant voices aren't even being heard. I mean, these decisions should be made by Afghans. We don't have any right to make a decision as between Biden and McChrystal.
It was interesting, Sunday's New York Times had a full page of what should we do about Afghanistan, 10 different opinions, not a single one of which was by an Afghani person.
Yeah, and they, they have voices. For example, there's an Afghan peace movement, pretty significant one. You can find out about it, but you're not going to read about it here. They have spokespersons, quite eloquent ones, some of them pretty impressive. The most impressive that I know is a woman named Malalai Joya, who's a remarkable woman. She's survived somehow, miraculously, struggling against the Russians, against the Reagan's favorite, the murderous warlords who took over and were so outrageous that the population welcomed the Taliban. She struggled against them, struggling against the return of the warlords, which is essentially the current government. Got elected to Parliament with a lot of support. Was quickly thrown out because she denounced the warlords who dominate the government, living underground, protected. But she speaks. She's written a book, and it's interesting. She gives talks. And her proposal, which is that of the Afghan peace movement, and maybe that of, for all we know, the large majority of Afghans, nobody looks, it's kind of supported more or less by the polls that are taken. But her position is Afghanistan needs an invasion of schools, hospitals, roads, not an invasion of guns and tanks. Afghans will, if given a chance, will work out the problems. We don't want we're subject to an assault from the Taliban, from the warlords, and from the occupying army. And we want to get out of that attack, and we have to work it out ourselves. So help us, but not this way. But that voice is not part of the debate.
I'm going to take some of our questions from the audience here at the Commonwealth Club tonight. Question asks, can movements like the green alternative energy movement make a true difference in the world if population continues to grow? And how can we globally ever come to an agreement to stop population growth if that's deemed necessary?
There's a lot understood. I mentioned before, not too much is known about human affairs, but something is understood about population growth. There are basically two ways to retard it. One way is the Chinese way, by force, and it's causing them plenty of problems, quite apart from the brutality of it. The other way to solve it is educate women. There's very good evidence that as education of women increases, a population declines, fertility declines, and levels, and sometimes even literally declines. There are some remarkable examples. So take, say, India. One of the poorer provinces in India, Kerala in the south, happens to have a very enlightened government since independence. We're not allowed to say it here, but it was a communist-led government, so forget that.
You're allowed here.
Not allowed
Commonwealth
to say it.
Club.
But it was pretty enlightened government. In fact, when Congress came in, they had to follow pretty much the same policies. Literacy is extremely high. There's education of women. And fertility has leveled and declined, unlike the rest of India. And it's happening in Europe, it's happening in Japan, it's happening everywhere. If women have options and choices, which they don't have in most of the world, then yes, population levels. In fact, in Europe and Japan, it's even declining. So there are two methods to deal with excessive population growth, and I think it's pretty obvious which one we should be pursuing. So I don't see that as the major problem. I mean, the ecological and environmental problems are enormous, grotesque, in fact. If the species succeeds in destroying itself, as it may, it'll be either from nuclear weapons or from destruction of the environment. And in both cases, in the case of the environmental threats, again, there are two tendencies in opposite directions. So compare it again with the 60s. Virtually no concern. The environmental movement was almost nothing. Now it's just a very substantial movement. It's a substantial popular movement pressing pretty hard on green alternatives, cutting down energy waste and so on. But there's a counter tendency, as there always is, the business world. Just recently, within the last few weeks, the American Petroleum Institute and the Chamber of Commerce, the biggest business lobby, and others, announced, you can read in the press, that they're inspired by the example of the health insurers who months ago knew that they had won. Like front page cover of Business Week in August, health insurers have won. We got it. They had a terrific technique which essentially killed the possibility of desperately needed health reform. They know it's going to tank the economy, but that's somewhere in the future. The personal consequences they don't care about. And, they have again, not that they're bad people. That's the way the institutions work. Well, the Petroleum Institute and Chamber of Commerce say we're going to follow that model and try to make sure that no serious energy environmental bills are passed by Congress. Now, there was an interesting split in the Chamber of Commerce. Some energy corporations pulled out and say we're not going to cooperate with this. You look at who they were, they're the ones who produce nuclear energy. So they'd like to have, tax on fossil fuel use, then they can make more money. They'll kill us some other way, But, and again, it's important to stress that these are not bad people. They're perfectly good people, just like anyone else. But they are working within an institutional framework which requires certain choices. If you don't make those choices, you're out. So the institutions require it. In fact, even the law requires it. You have to be committed to maximizing profit and growth in the short term. That's amplified by perverse incentives, like the too big to fail government insurance policy, which is now even bigger than it was before, thanks to the bank bailout and the way the money was distributed, and other perverse, incentives like tying CEO pay to short-term gain and other structures like that.
Well, let me ask you about another incentive that doesn't come in that way. The peak oil incentive. You're certainly familiar with that theory. If it happens, and you can tell us if you believe it's happening or is going to happen, do you believe that it fatally endangers democracy and would move us inevitably towards nationalist or fascist policies? This is a question from the audience.
Well, my own feeling, peak oil will come sooner or later, of course, it's a finite resource, but it's a complex notion. The real question is not how much oil is underground, but how much can be extracted at an economically feasible price. Now, it's pushing the limits now. Oil extraction is more and more costly and more environmentally dangerous because you're going after sources that are harder to use. At some point, it'll become impossible to continue, but nobody knows how far that point is. However, from another point of view, we're probably better off if peak oil comes sooner, because that will reduce the use of fossil fuels and help preserve an environment for our grandchildren to live in. And business knows this. Take, say, the Wall Street Journal. They've been the leading deniers of global warming. You read the editorial pages; it makes Rush Limbaugh look like a moderate. But a couple of weeks ago, they ran a supplement on the environment, which took a very strong stand on the need for radical measures to try to sustain the environment. In fact, they even called for geoengineering. They said that the measures being considered in Washington aren't enough. Well, there's a reason for that. These are, after all, the people who own the world. They don't want their possession destroyed. So they have mixed motives too. But it's the population that's going to have to drive this. And in that respect, there has been pretty substantial progress in the last 30, 40 years.
Speaking of something the population is going to have to drive, I'm going to change topics with another question from the audience here. Right after I remind our radio listeners, they're listening to the Commonwealth Club of California radio program. I'm Larry Bensky. Our guest is Noam Chomsky, linguist, political activist, and author, most recently, of The Essential Chomsky, edited by Anthony Arnov. This question from the audience, Noam Chomsky, is, do you think that taking money out of politics, fair election, clean money campaigns, is, first of all, possible in this country? And second of all, would it be effective in solving many of our political problems in the United States?
I think it wouldn't be easy because there are a lot of ways to get around any regulations, but it would be possible. However, and it would certainly have a good effect. Campaign funding is a remarkably good predictor of election and also of policy. You can pretty well predict policies by looking at where the campaign funding comes from. There's good political science work on this. Thomas Ferguson, very fine political economist, has done extremely good work on this, and it's convincing. And in fact, we see it right in front of us all the time. So the rate of election of incumbents is overwhelming. It's like 98, 99%. This is happening at the same time that public attitudes towards approval of Congress is in the low teens. But they're outspending their opponents. So, okay, they get elected, even if people don't like them. Or just take the last election, 2008. The core of Obama's funding was financial institutions. They preferred him to McCain. They thought he'd serve them better. And it's turning out it's probably true. You can almost read off the policies of the administration from looking at the concentrated campaign funding. Financial institutions are doing marvelously. So yes, taking money out of politics would be a good idea, very good. It's not going to solve all our problems, they're much deeper than that. But it would be substantial, it would be hard, because there are all kind of ways to get around it. But it's an important topic, and here tendencies are going in the wrong direction. Right now, the Supreme Court is considering a suit which, what it amounts to is if they change the law, which they probably will, it means that corporations can buy elections directly instead of indirectly. So that they don't put it that way, but you think through it, that's what it amounts to. So that's what the Supreme Court is doing. And there's something kind of surreal going on, because at the very same time, the logic of this for the Supreme Court is that corporations are persons. They have personal rights, so therefore have the right of free speech. That was, in fact, a gift to the corporate world by the courts about a century ago. Conservatives who used to exist, the name does, not the category, bitterly condemned it. They called it a form of communism, a return to feudalism, and so on. But they got it, and by now they have rights way beyond persons. So because they have rights of persons, they have the right of free speech, so therefore they can buy elections directly. At the same time, there's a competition going on in Congress between the Democrats and the Republicans to see who can be more brutal in denying health care to undocumented aliens. And there's a legal argument behind that, too. They're not persons under the law. The courts have shaped American law so that if you're an undocumented alien, you're not a person. You don't have personal rights. So on the one hand, corporate entities have rights of persons and have to be allowed to buy elections directly. On the other hand, undocumented aliens on whose backs a lot of the economy rides, they're not persons, and therefore we, the Democrats and the Republicans, have to show that we're more savage than the opposition in denying them health care. We shouldn't be allowing this to happen before our eyes. I mean, the facts are there, but they're not being discussed. They're not being addressed. And that's another serious lack of people who care about living in a civilized community.
Well, we've reached the point in our program where we have time for only one last question from our audience, and we'll kind of come back to where we were at the beginning of this discussion with Noam Chomsky. What answer would you give to the frustrated, hardworking people, as you describe them, attracted by the narrative of the right that you listen to, Brave You, on AM talk radio?
Well, take the fact that their incomes have stagnated for 30 years, their benefits decline, work hours are going up, and so on. Then,
well, suppose they say that's because the government's giving all its money to
so we should be giving them the right answer.
Immigrants.
The right answer is that has to do with the reconstruction of the economy that took place in the 1970s, which shifted us from a high-growth, relatively egalitarian economy, the 50s and the 60s, to what's called a neoliberal economy, with a vast growth of financial institutions, evisceration of productive capacity, shifting it abroad where it's more profitable. And yeah, this has lots of predictable effects. One of them is the financial crises that happen periodically. The growth of the financial institutions is phenomenal, and that doesn't help people. Say in 1970 it was maybe 3% of gross domestic product. Now it's well over 30%. Well, you know, that's great for Goldman Sachs and so on. It's not great for these people who are concerned that their lives are falling apart. We should tell them that. We should tell them that the heroes, that there is a massive business-run corporate program. Its scale is astonishing. It's been pretty well studied. It goes back to the 1950s. It was designed, as I said before, to make people hate and fear government but there's a little secret behind it. The people who are running the campaign love government, and they want it to be powerful and interventionist, but in their interest. But what people are told is supposed to hate government. So take, for example, April 15th. Okay, when April 15th comes along, in the comparable date in a functioning democracy, people would be applauding. They say, okay, this is the day in which we get together and provide the resources for the programs that we have decided on. What could be better than that? In the United States, thanks to massive propaganda, you're supposed to hate April 15th, because that's the day when some alien force, like from Mars, is coming down here and stealing your hard-earned money. Well, that's a real triumph in undermining and destroying the fundamental basis of democracy. And for elite opinion, for business, that makes sense. They don't like democracy. Elites never do. Well, that's our failure to have permitted this to happen.
Well, let me also put in a word for media literacy here, because along with the developments you're talking about came deregulation of ownership of radio and television stations, abolition of the fairness doctrine so that radio and television no longer had to provide any balance in their discussion of public issues, and the rise of the talk radio fanatics that have distorted public debate in this country, and television, of course, an entire network.
You're right, and I think it's very important. But I think we should be asking questions about ourselves. Why don't we exploit this situation, make use of it, reach these people with a sensible message that can lead them and us to better lives and a more democratic society? Well, got to do that. There's a tremendous amount of activism in the country. I suspect that if you count noses, more than in the 60s. But it's a very atomized, isolated society. People in one corner of town don't know what's happening in the other corner of town. There are separate agendas. There's sectarianism. We got to have our way. You can't have your way. The success in atomizing the society has been enormous.
Has the internet played into that?
The internet, I think, has a complicated effect. It does separate people, because you're not, one thing about human beings is face-to-face communication means something. Communicating through, a text message doesn't have that meaning. So it does separate people. And in fact, it contributes to the ideal of the business world, which is a society in which the elementary, the atoms are a dyad, you and the tube, but no communication other than that. That's a tremendous technique of control. So it has that effect. On the other hand, it's it is the tool for all the organizing and activist efforts that go on, and also for education. So the internet really is like a lot of technology. It's fundamentally neutral, depends who's using it and for what purpose.
And how class stratified do you think it will continue to be? Do you see any tendencies towards greater participation, people having more access to that technology?
Yeah. There's more access, but more access alone doesn't help you. If the access that you have leads to a huge range of choices where you have no framework or structure to decide what makes sense, then it's negative. If there's more access that's guided and directed by the kind of understanding and comprehension that can really only come out of cooperative efforts.
And education.
Which is a cooperative effort if it's serious. That kind of access makes sense. It's very much like the sciences. Suppose you're, say, a biologist, say the woman who just won the Nobel Prize. She didn't become a great biologist by reading everything in the biology journals, or randomly picking out things that appeared in the biology journals. They'll destroy you. She became a good biologist by having an understanding of what to look for, having a framework of comprehension and insight that comes out of cooperative activities. Science is a cooperative activity. There's occasional people who work on their own, but mostly it's highly interactive, and it at best, not always, it does lead to understanding, interchange, communication, improvement of your thinking, directing it better, and out of that comes a way to kind of wade through the huge mass of information there and find out what's significant.
But if all you are trained to care about is your belief system, uninstructed by anything other than tradition, you're in a different framework.
That's very bad. And if what you're trained for from childhood is to pass the next test, it's worse. It destroys your thinking. There's a name for that. It's called No Child Left Behind. Which really means every child left behind. I mean, if that's every one of us is, we've mostly gone to good schools and so on. I'm sure you have the same experience I've had. You had to pass an exam, maybe the SATs or whatever it is. So you study like a maniac. You pass the exam, you forget everything the next day, because that's not the way to learn anything. I was talking to a teacher the other day, actually, while I was here, who very, like most teachers, very much opposed to all of this. And she was describing, she has a daughter in the schools. I forget what grade, but she was telling me that her daughter is in a class where they were studying the Constitution. And the teacher told the class, or maybe the book told them, that Georgia didn't participate in the Constitutional Convention. And her daughter came home and told her, she said, I was curious, I want to know why. So I asked the teacher, why didn't Georgia join? And the teacher's answer was, well, we don't have time for that. We've got to get to the next point so that you'll be able to pass the test.
And speaking of not having time, our thanks very much to Dr. Noam Chomsky, author most recently. Noam Chomsky, author most recently of The Essential Chomsky. We also want to thank our audiences here in San Francisco and on the radio for the Commonwealth Club. I'm Larry Bensky. Now this meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California, celebrating more than a century of enlightened discussion, is adjourned.